Popular opinion about Lear's eldest two daughters, Goneril and Regan, is clear. They are personifications of evil, as evidenced by descriptions such as utter monsters from the Romantic poet Samuel T. Coleridge in 1849 and paradigms of evil from English professor Maynard Mack in 1972. Why? Let's look closely first at their appearances and behaviour in the play. Well, the dramatic first scene of the play sees the elderly King Leir making the, with hindsight, ridiculous decision to divvy up his kingdom between his daughters. All the girls have to do is participate in an ingratiating, sickly public game show in which they outdo each other, saying how much they love their father. Even better, there's only one round within said game show. Once you've turned your stomach with a few outpourings of gush, you're done. You've won the jackpot of a share in 11th century Britain. Goneril and Regan agree to flatter, but the youngest daughter, Cordelia, doesn't, causing the father to erupt and disinherit, leaving the two elder daughters with half the country each. Bingo! But it's primarily events post the Act 1, Scene 1 game show that cement Goneril and Regan's reputation as having no conscience, only appetite, this time from the sparknotes.com website. Firstly, Goneril quickly tires of the behaviour of Lear, his fool, and his 100 knights, whom he has stipulated must come with him as befitting his dignity. She makes arguably patronising comments to Lear about his old age and declares that his 100 knights are men so disordered, so debauched and bold that this our court, infected with their manners, shows like a riotous inn. She even goes on to state that epicurism, meaning gluttony, riotous living, and lust, makes it more like a tavern or a brothel than a grace palace. The comparison is unquestionably a stark one, suggesting that her father, the king's retinue, has transformed her palace into a lawless pub riddled with constant drinking and shagging, is only going to have one effect on Lear, and that is to deeply, deeply offend. Consequently, Goneril demands her father to cut his retinue in half, and the effect of these exchanges is to see Lear furiously depart her home in search of kinder, more natural treatment from her younger sister, Regan. Unfortunately, Regan, hearing a skewed version about what has happened from Goneril, decides to leave her home, so that she is not present when her father arrives. Instead, she heads to the Earl of Gloucester's castle. Lear has sent on a messenger before him, who happens to be the disguised Earl of Kent. However, Kent gets involved in a petty broil with one of Goneril's servants and responds churlishly and imprudently when questioned by Regan's husband, the Duke of Cornwall. Irritated, the Duke of Cornwall decides to humiliate both Kent and, by extension, Lear by putting him in the stocks. Regan enthusiastically supports this decision and implies that a punishment of him sitting there until noon is ridiculously inadequate. Till noon? Till night, my lord, and all night too. When Lear arrives, he is understandably horrified to see his messenger sitting in the stocks and interprets it as extraordinarily disrespectful to himself. Following a cagey exchange between Lear, Regan and Cornwall, Goneril's arrival is heralded by a trumpet call. The subsequent conversation on stage sees Goneril and Regan ganging up on their father to humiliate him, with once again the main bone of contention being his insistence on maintaining 100 knights. What? 50 followers? Says one. 5 and 20, says the other, followed swiftly by what need you 5 and 20, 10 or 5, and finally, what need 1? The net effect of this is that Lear, his pride wounded beyond all previous imaginings, refuses to stay with either of his daughters, and instead storms off into a wild night. The daughters refuse to call him back, or subsequently try to find him to reopen negotiations. Lear suffers terribly during the storm. He rips off his clothing, hurls impotent abuse at the wind and rain, and flickers between penetrating reason and madness. Meanwhile, Regan and Cornwall find out that their host, the Duke of Gloucester, is sympathetic towards an invading force from France, led by Lear's youngest disinherited daughter Cordelia, which is intent on gaining revenge for Lear's perceived ill treatment. Furious Cornwall seizes upon an unfortunate turn of phrase used by Gloucester and gouges out his eyes. Once again, he is egged on by Regan in this. With just one eye taken out, she demands greedily, one side will mock the other, another, the other too. As the play comes to its inevitable Shakespearean tragedy conclusion, i.e. a stage littered with bodies, Regan and Goneril end up fighting over their deep sexual attraction for Edmund, the Duke of Gloucester's bastard son. The dying moments of the play see Regan poisoned by Goneril and Goneril stabbing herself to death. So that's a brief summary of Regan and Goneril's involvement in the play. I now want to move to the main body of this lecture, in which I'd like to examine their behaviour in the light of the main source text for the play, the anonymous Elizabethan play King Leir, spelt L-E-I-R, which was first printed in 1605, just a year before Shakespeare's version was first performed. I want to start by suggesting that the source King Leir is a far more attractive character than his Shakespearean successor. You can see on screen now the lines with which he opens the play.
Thus to our grief the obsequies performed of our too late deceased and dearest queen, whose soul, I hope, possessed of heavenly joys, doth ride in triumph amongst the cherubims. There are 2 points immediately to take from this when considering a comparative interpretation of the two kings. Firstly, this Lear is starting the play by revealing his own feelings of love, in this case towards a dearly beloved but departed queen, but also positioning himself as a committed Christian. He hopes the queen is in heaven amongst the angels. This is in stark contrast to Shakespeare's King Leir, whose opening lines consist of imperative commands and formal declarations about dividing his kingdom, prior to which he needs to know which of his daughters doth love us most. But concisely, one king reveals his own vulnerabilities and love. The other, like an automaton, demands it. And so, the early impressions are that the earlier King Leir, that's spelt L-E-I-R, may be a far more human character, someone we are more likely to be able to empathise with. He has lost his wife and is still mourning for her, whilst his Christian sentiments implies a degree of uncertain humility. Like other Christians, he hopes and believes that the faithful departed can rise to new life after death, but he cannot be completely certain. You can see where I'm beginning to go with this argument. A comparative reading may suggest that out of the two Lears, it is Shakespeare's Lear who may merit slightly harsher treatment than his predecessor.
Another way in which the earlier Lear seems a far more attractive character is seen in the way he talks about intra-family dynamics. Referring to his daughters, he confesses,
"Although ourselves do dearly tender them, yet are we ignorant of their affairs. For fathers best do know to govern sons, but daughters' steps the mother's counsel turns." Modern audiences are likely to nod in agreement with these sentiments. Fathers may well dote on their daughters, but many of us would agree that a parent of the same sex may be better positioned to provide the best guidance, particularly as the child transitions into adulthood. This Lear is shown once again to be happy to describe his own feelings, prior to demanding them from others, and it is such a contrast to the despotic King Leir we see in the first scene of Shakespeare's play. Shakespeare's King Leir is initially not a man prepared to admit to any weaknesses, or indeed to even consider that he has any. At the first hint of insubordination, he aligns himself aggressively with ancient gods and mythical creatures to curse any who appear to contradict his whimsies. First Cordelia, to whom he declares that he disclaims all my paternal care, and as a stranger to my heart and me, hold thee from this for ever. And then immediately afterwards, Kent. So one Lear recognises that he has weaknesses. The other does not, at least at the beginning of the play, and reacts with extraordinary anger when someone seems to go against what he is saying. Particularly reading the plays within our 21st century context, in which blind, loyal at all cost homage for either a father or monarch is not considered a priority, or even in some cases appropriate. This comparative approach emphasises the unpleasantness of Shakespeare's king, who clearly has a great deal to learn about life and human beings.
So Shakespeare has made his King Leir far more dictatorial and hectoring, far more cold and aloof. How has he transformed the two elder daughters, Goneril and Regan? And what insight can we glean from exploring their original characters within the anonymous Leir version? Well, just as the earlier King Leir is much nicer, so his two elder daughters, Goneril, spelt differently, ending fittingly in ILL, and Regan, spelt RAGAN, are much nastier. In scene 2 of the play, they are seen discussing their younger sister, Cordelia, of whom they are both jealous due to her dazzling beauty. Unlike in Shakespeare's version, none of the three daughters are yet married, which to some extent may explain insecure, bitchy comments such as,
"Some desperate medicine must be soon applied to dim the glory of Cordelia's mounting fame." These ambiguous words indicate that Regan is already plotting, already contriving to cause harm to others. And remember, this is even before she has become aware of their father's plan to host a filial love contest and divide the kingdom. It is also noticeable that during the love contest in scene 3, they publicly comment on Cordelia's responses, and in doing so, egg on their father to act rashly upon his insecurities. When Cordelia declares, "I cannot paint my duty forth in words, I hope my deeds shall make report for me, but look what love the child doth owe the father, the same to you I bear, my gracious lord." Goneril helps frame her father's response by spitting scornfully, "Here is an answer answerless indeed. Were you my daughter, I should scarcely brook it." Regan also manages to chip in before her father and questions her younger sister scornfully and hypocritically. "Dost thou not blush, proud peacock, as thou art, to make our father such a slight reply?" The sister's use of language, Goneril's polyptoton, as seen in the repetition of the same word roots in "Here is an answer answerless," and Regan's alliterative metaphor, labelling her younger sister as a proud peacock, aim to suggest that Cordelia's behaviour is unacceptably conceited and disrespectful, which to some extent prompts their father to condemn her even more strongly.
What do Goneril and Regan say during Shakespeare's version of the same scene? Yes, they flatter, but they do not butt in following Cordelia's equivalent restrained comments about her feelings towards her father. In fact, they say nothing at all until much later in the scene, when a now exiled Cordelia is preparing to leave the stage. Even then, they only respond when Cordelia references what she feels are their faults and worries how they would treat their father. Regan snaps succinctly, "Prescribe not us our duties," whilst Goneril, the elder sister of the three, and so perhaps understandably irritated at being preached to, rather cattily advises,
Let your study be to content your lords, who have received you at fortune's arms. You have obedience scanted, and well are worth the wants that you have wanted. In this quotation, Goneril is suggesting that Cordelia deserves to be treated with a lack of kindness by her husband, well are worth the wants, because she has herself shown a lack of kindness and duty that you have wanted to her father by refusing to showcase her affection for him. The overall effect of this slightly confusing but neat-sounding phrase, which once again uses polyptoton, is to emphasize Goneril's control over language, and by implication her control over her life at this point, which sharply contrasts to her younger sister's far less certain outlook. So in Shakespeare's play, Goneril and Regan may be in control, and may have inherited half the kingdom. But unlike in the source text, they have not done anything beyond humouring their father to achieve this. They have not tried to influence their father's response to Cordelia's nothings, or at least if they have, it would have been solely through body language and sound effects, such as tuts or outraged glares towards their sister, included as part of a particular director's interpretation. Neither have they shown any massively noteworthy animosity or particular jealousy towards their younger sister. Overall, in the early stages of Shakespeare's play, indeed, there is no real evidence to suggest that Goneril and Regan are anything other than typical daughters, prepared to humour an old man's slightly irritating caprices. Cordelia may claim that time shall unfold what plighting cunning hides, who covers faults at last with shame derides. But for the modern audience, it is surely crazy-tempered Lear himself and hell-bent on boasting about past legovers Gloucester, who are the two characters most worthy of our opprobrium.
It is also important to note that Goneril and Regan of King Leir seem far more calculating than their Shakespearean counterparts. Unlike in Shakespeare's play, the audience sees them being briefed about the love challenge in advance. Scaliger, a follower of King Leir, is told in scene 1 of the king's plans and duly briefs Goneril and Regan. The daughters aggressively plan to flatter their father to such a ridiculous extent that Cordelia's words in comparison will seem tepid and disrespectful. Goneril proposes,
I will so flatter with my doting father, as he were ne'er so flattered in his life. Nay, I will say that if it be his pleasure to match me with a beggar, I will yield, for why, I know whatever I will say, he means to match me with the Cornwall king. This speech paints Goneril as far more calculating and devious than her Shakespearean counterpart. She feels sufficiently secure in her future matrimonial prospects that she feels she could even say she would be prepared to marry a beggar in order to show her devotion to him. But Shakespeare has not included this briefing scene, meaning that the audience doesn't know whether the daughters have been alerted beforehand, and surely Cordelia's panicked, terrifyingly brief asides of nothing must indicate that she at least knew nothing about the charade. The assumption should therefore be that the daughters didn't know that they would be put on the spot, thus meaning that Goneril and Regan are frantically improvising when they declare, rather improbably, that they love their father dearer than eyesight, space and liberty, or that they profess themselves an enemy to all other joys that don't fit in with their undying devotion. Shakespeare's Goneril and Regan are therefore unquestionably guilty of flattery, but not the cynical, calculating, pre-planned flattery that is seen in the earlier text.
It is also noticeable that Shakespeare cuts the number of lines in which the elder daughters gush about their love. Both Goneril and Regan have 17 compared to 7 and 8 in Shakespeare's version. Indeed, you could argue in Shakespeare that when Goneril finishes her little speech with,
beyond all manner of so much I love you, that she has run out of things to say, or alternatively, she is simply not prepared to flatter endlessly in the way of her breezy counterparts, whose suggestions include the idea that she would be prepared to be tied to a large stone and jump into the sea in order to show her devotion and sense of duty. Indeed, close analysis of Regan's speech in Shakespeare's play also comes across as a little vague and not particularly thought out. She feeds off Goneril's words and tries to trump them, only she comes too short. It is so much easier to disparage someone else's gushing words rather than invent fresh, flattering ones yourself. And indeed, such an approach could be interpreted as an implicit refusal to fully participate in the distasteful spectacle. There are no such hints in the 17 effusive lines that Regan pours forth in King Leir. She decides to showcase her so-called love by declaring that she could marry anyone her father put in front of her, totally irrespective of her own wishes and desires.
So, should we slightly reconsider the presentation of Goneril and Regan in Act 1, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's play, following a reading of Goneril and Regan in the earlier play? Yes, I think we should. Comparatively speaking, they are relatively restrained and don't make matters worse for Cordelia. Their flattering speeches are rather short and not as over-the-top or ridiculous as they could have been. Additionally, there is evidence to suggest that they may have been taken aback by the whole love contest as much as everyone else on stage, and are simply frantically thinking on the spot to avoid giving any embarrassment towards their all-domineering father. Further reading of King Leir also forces the reader to reconsider the dynamics between Lear and Goneril and Regan once the former has started his ill-fated sojourns at their houses. There is a crucial difference between the texts in that the 100 Knights emerge as a Shakespearean addition. In the earlier text, Lear declares that he will first sojourn
with my son of Cornwall, and take me to my prayers and my beads. Whereas in Shakespeare's text, I've already made reference to Goneril's complaints in Act 1, Scene 4 about the effects of having so many extra people to cater for. She claims that her royal court now appears like a riotous inn. What would be interesting on a purely speculative level would be to somehow find out whether Shakespeare's King Leir would have suffered so much if he had gone solo and had never dreamed up the surely always doomed to end in disaster plan to keep a retinue of 100 knights. Could he have lived happily ever after, alternating between Goneril and Regan's castles? Possibly not particularly happily, but there is surely no doubt that it would have taken much longer for things to come to a head. And there is also a possibility that with the longer time period, Lear might have been able to cope better with the gradual loss of his dignity and power.
So what I'm emphasising here is that a comparative reading stresses that Shakespeare's Goneril and Regan have plenty to complain about. Who would you prefer to host? A Christian former king armed just with prayers and beads? Or a pagan former king armed, literally, with 100 knights? Is it any wonder that Goneril's patience snapped so quickly, and that Regan hot-footed it from her castle even before her father had arrived? And as we continue to probe King Leir, the gap between the evil Goneril and Regan and their Shakespearean counterparts only widens. For, unlike in Shakespeare's play, the pair actively state that they would prefer their irritating father to be dead. The first sign of this is in scene 12, when Goneril declares that she will intercept a messenger sent to find out whether her father has arrived at her sister's residence. She speculates dreamily.
He happily may by travelling unknown ways fall sick, and as a common passenger be dead and buried. Would God it were so well! For then there were no more to do but this, he went away, and none knows where he is. Within Goneril's hopeful revelries, her father will simply die of his own accord, leaving here with, in an ominous phrase, no more to do. Later in the scene, fueled by signs of acquiescence and a general willingness to oblige from the messenger, she is even more explicit when she states, "If my sister thinketh convenient, as my letters importeth, to make him away, hast thou the heart to effect it?" Regan, egged on by Goneril's inaccurate descriptions of her father's behaviour at her residence, Julie does think that it is convenient, and uses a similarly phrased question to ask the messenger, "Hast thou the heart to act a stratagem, and give a stab or two, if need require?" So, in King Leir, Leir, both sisters use stereotypical notions of masculinity to their advantage. Real men are brave, have a heart, and can carry out difficult, manly tasks when it is convenient for them to do so. Thus, the messenger is left under no illusions that both daughters want their father dead, and they are prepared to reward him handsomely for doing so.
Evil, wicked. And so what about Shakespeare's Goneril and Regan? How does their plotting compare? Well, it is comparatively lily-livered, and dare I say it, loving-ish. Well, as in the older texts, Goneril attempts to sway Regan unfairly against her father, telling her manservant Oswald in Act 1, Scene 4 to
"Inform Regan full of my particular fear, and thereto add such reasons of your own as may compact it more. It is certainly underhand and horribly undignified to ask a servant to embellish an account in order to add additional discredit to someone who is both your father and a king. But yet, how much should we blame her? Let's rewind a little. Following Goneril's objections to the behaviour of Lear's 100 knights, there they are again, Lear called her, and these are in chronological order, degenerate bastard, marble, he-hearted fiends, detested kites. Plus he called on the goddess of nature to make her barren forever and dry up in her the organs of increase. Do you want some more? Well, he also suggests that she has a wolfish visage, and in Act 2, Scene 4, refers to her as a boil, a plague sore, or embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. Even taking account of the fact I've used selective editing in order to support my argument, this is a disgracefully abusive tirade, and no way, under any circumstances whatsoever, to address your own daughter. And note that, unlike in King Leir, these daughters have not directly conspired to kill their father, and never suggest at any point that they would like him dead, although Regan does tell the Weasley Oswald that if he do chance to hear of that blind traitor Gloucester, preferment falls on him that cuts him off.
So, how should we sum up this talk, which is aimed at shedding a softer light on Lear's two elder daughters? Well, using a comparative analysis approach, we find out that Shakespeare's Lear is far more of a despotic megalomaniac than his predecessor. That Shakespeare's Goneril and Regan are less conniving and ignore Cordelia rather than actively conspire against her. That they have far more to put up with, notably in relation to Lear's 100 knights. That although they allow Lear to head into the storm, they never try to kill him or have him killed. Now, of course, we need to be careful how far we take this approach. Common sense suggests that evilness must lie on a spectrum, and surely it is possible that Shakespeare's Goneril and Regan are still on this line, just not as far up as Goneril and Regan. However, a contemporary reading of King Leir needs to take account of the world in which we inhabit. It is a world in which there is comparatively little tolerance for the whims and vagaries of the old, as seen in the proliferation of old age homes, places where the younger generations can literally wash their hands free of and remove the inconvenience of elderly parents who need support. Indeed, how can we sit back and condemn Goneril and Regan when really they are acting exactly as we could act at some uncomfortable points in the future? This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring Shakespeare's reinterpretation of the anonymous play King Leir, L-E-I-R, with a particular focus on the presentation of Lear's relationship with his two elder daughters. Many thanks for watching.